Hi there, I'm Andreas Marazis, and I'm the host of the ENC In Depth podcast. Today's in-depth discussion is dedicated to the recently published and peer-reviewed academic volume, Principal Pragmatism in Practice, the EU's policy towards Russia after Crimea, edited by Dr. Fabienne Bossuyt and Dr. Peter van Elsuwege. The volume is part of the Brill series, Studies in EU External Relations. I was privileged and honored to be part of this excellent book project, and I contributed with a chapter on addressing cybersecurity threats from Russia in the EU. And for that, I'm extremely grateful to the two masterminds who accepted actually my invitation and managed to be virtually present in today's ENC In Depth podcast so as to guide us through this extremely relevant and timely publication dedicated to EU-Russia relations. A tough topic, to put it mildly, to deal with, not only for policymakers, but also for civil society and researchers, and not only at present, but in the years to come. But let me introduce our two distinguished guests to all of you today. So, ladies first, so I will start with Dr. Fabienne Bossuyt, who is Assistant Professor at the Center for EU Studies at the Department of Political Science, Ghent University. She is also the co-director of the Russia platform at Ghent University, among other things. And I'm also pleased to say, and I'm equally proud to say that she's an academic council member at the European Neighbourhood Council. Peter van Elsuwege is a professor of EU law and Jean Monnet Chair at Ghent University, where he's co-director of the Ghent European Law Institute. So, Fabienne, Peter, welcome to the ENC In Depth podcast. It's great to have you both here.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and it's a great opportunity to talk about our recent published book.
Likewise, thank you very much for this invitation. We are extremely honored, really, to be able to present a book in this podcast.
Excellent. So I couldn't be happier to have both of you for this specific podcast here. So let's get down to business and let's start with our discussion about this excellent book. Now, first question is addressed to you, Peter. Now, as the EU's relations with Russia remain at an all-time low and continue to be in a state of paralysis, marked by deinstitutionalization, inertia, and estrangement, the EU's policy towards Russia seems up for review. Now, I would like to kickstart our discussion by asking you, why do you think that this book project is relevant and timely released?
Thank you, Andreas, for this question. I think that the EU is struggling with defining its approach towards Russia for quite some time now, and actually we can see that particularly after the enlargement of the European Union, the eastward enlargement, that the EU initially defined Russia as a strategic partner because there was this belief that enlargement would be beneficial not only for the countries that joined the EU, but also for the neighboring countries, including Russia. But it soon became clear that this assumption did not hold true, and that we had a growing gap, I would call it, between the, let's say, the official discourse at the time of Russia as a strategic partner, but the growing distrust, on the other hand, which became visible on several occasions, and which, of course, became tremendously visible when we had the Ukraine conflict. So that, let's say, was a little bit the background of our book project, and it's also the title of the introduction to which we wrote together with Fabienne, the introduction to the book, which is the evolution of Russia from a strategic partner to a strategic challenge, because this is how Russia was defined for the first time, I think, by the High Representative Mogherini about some 5 years ago, when she said that, well, Russia now for the EU is a challenge, is a strategic challenge, and we need to redefine our approach towards Russia, particularly also after the events in Ukraine, where the EU first responded with a sanctions regime. But then there was the understanding that a new framework needed to be adopted. And that's also the point of departure to a large extent of our book project. That is the global strategy of the European Union, which proceeded from the notion of principled pragmatism. And principled pragmatism, which is also in the title of the book, that's the idea that the EU will remain firm on its principles, respect for international law in particular, but also tries to be pragmatic and tries to be open up for engagement in certain areas where there is a common interest. So, and this then perhaps could be seen as a kind of operationalization of this principle and into 5 guiding principles, which is the structure of the book. And that was the idea, that we'll try to make a kind of assessment of where we are in terms of EU-Russia relations and the EU's approach towards Russia. Yeah, we believe that this is still very timely. I mean, only this week, the new High Representative Brill discussed the state of EU-Russia relations in the European Parliament, and he also referred to this 5 principles that remain relevant for the time being, even though that was part of the conclusions in the book. In the longer term, I think this is perhaps a kind of intermediate step in between the sanctions, which we had immediately after the crisis, and a new long-term strategic framework afterwards. But we're not there yet. And for the time being, I think these 5 guiding principles remain very relevant, and that's to a large extent the contribution of the book, the assessment to this concept and these principles.
Thank you very much, Peter. Fabienne, may I have your take also on the rationale behind this book, and also on, why you believe that this is also timely?
Yes, of course. Well, I would also say that, of course, several developments in the past few months have shown that the EU's relations with Russia continue deteriorating. So clearly, yes, the relations remain at an all-time low, and actually they are even further sliding backwards. And this is, of course, very worrisome. And I think it's also clear that the EU's current policy of these 5 principles, they need to be evaluated. So they were introduced in the wake of the crisis over Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, but yeah, this is already 5-6 years ago. And so now I think it was really important that we evaluated this current policy so that we really have a concrete idea of what is working and what is not working in this policy. And so this is what academics can bring, and we can really bring evidence-based insights, because definitely now these are needed more than ever. And based on these insights, it's possible to reassess the EU's current policy so that it can be improved where necessary. But then if we go to the rationale of the book, maybe I can also highlight that the origins of the book go back to a conference which was organized in 2017 under the auspices of the Russia platform of Ghent University. And so the title of this conference was EU-Russia Relations, How to Get Out of the Midlife Crisis. So already in 2017, we were, of course, driven by this question. And it seems that several years later, the crisis has just got worse. But so that this conference brought together quite a large number of both scholars and practitioners from various disciplines, and they really presented research and discussed research. So we had a nice dialogue also between academics and practitioners. And so we were really focusing on the evolution of the EU-Russia relationship after the conflict in Ukraine, and also then in light of the implementation of the EU's global strategy. Then as a follow-up of this conference, we had an academic workshop also in Ghent a year later, where we were taking stock already of further developments, but where we already were laying the ground of this book through in-depth discussions of draft versions of the chapters. Now, as Peter already mentioned, so the aim of the book was really to take stock of the implementation of the 5 principles, so which constitute together the current policy framework behind the EU's relations with Russia. But more concretely, we really wanted to examine the implications of each of these 5 principles for the EU's relations with Russia. And in doing this, we wanted to assess really the state of implementation of each of these principles. So this implies that we wanted to see really what is currently working and what is not working. And so we really wanted to have a more concrete insight into what challenges the EU is still faced with in implementing these principles. And then in making this assessment, we of course wanted to have a rather forward-looking perspective, in the sense that our goal was really to contribute to a better understanding of the current EU-Russia relationship and also about the prospects for overcoming this existing deadlock. And we intentionally also wanted to have a broad approach, so namely a broad interdisciplinary approach. And so therefore we really wanted to combine insights from various disciplines, so from EU studies, also international relations, but also from European law and international law. Now, if we look at the literature on EU-Russia relations, it's clear that all scholars will paint a rather bleak picture of the EU-Russia relationship. And they have been doing this already for quite some time. And already 5-6 years ago, they really saw little scope for improvement. And mostly this is because scholars were pointing to the absence of a long-term concept of cooperation that is shared by both EU and Russia. And so basically they point to this lack of a common vision of the future relationship and future cooperation between them. Now, it's also important to mention that most scholars in the literature, they emphasize that the current crisis in the relationship between the EU and Russia already started a while ago. So it did not, well, the current crisis that of course started following the annexation of Crimea and the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Well, you can basically just see this as a culmination of a process of downward descent that had already been going on for decades. And I think it's also very interesting to emphasize this, that this crisis didn't start with the annexation of Crimea. Basically, this was just a culmination of something that had already been going on for over 10 years. Now, when scholars try to explain this gradual deterioration of the relationship and the current deadlock in the relationship, several theoretical perspectives are used in the literature. And also in this regard, we deliberately decided not to take a specific theoretical stance, but we did align ourselves with what constructivists and post-structuralists have pointed out, namely that there is a normative discord between the EU and Russia, and also a very clear clash of identity. And so in line with studies that argue this, and so which really point to the importance of looking into images, and so how do they portray themselves, and how do they see themselves, and how do they see the other. So really we wanted to take this into account in the book, and therefore it was also a deliberate choice to bring together academics working in different disciplines, but also in different academic environments, meaning we wanted to have academics both from European universities and from Russian universities. So this for us was really, let's say, an essential part in order to make sure that we really have a clear view on how both EU and Russia see each other and see themselves. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Fabienne, for explaining the rationale and the objectives, the aims of the book. I guess it must have been quite challenging task to handle all these contributors from Russia and the EU, but I guess a very rewarding experience. Now, I would like to go back to you, Peter, and based on what both of you and Fabienne mentioned about the structure of the book, based on the 5 guiding principles for EU-Russia relations. Now, for each principle, scholars from various disciplines analyze the most significant challenges regarding the implementation of the principles and their consequences. Can you please guide us through the book and its respective chapters briefly? I would like to start with you, Peter, and then Fabienne, feel free to jump in and join us as well. Thank you.
So yes, indeed. I mean, the structure of the book, as we mentioned, is based upon these 5 guiding principles. So it means that the first part of the book focuses essentially on the Minsk agreements and the sanctions regime in EU-Russia relations, because it has been a consistent approach of the EU that the potential relaxation of the sanctions regime, which were gradually introduced after the annexation of Crimea, but particularly after the events in eastern Ukraine and the downing of flight MH17, that the relaxation of this sanction regime is only possible when there is an implementation of the Minsk agreements. So that's, let's say, the core message of this first principle. And in this part, we have several contributions. The first contribution by Fabienne van Severen looks into the backgrounds and also the content of the Minsk agreements and the Minsk process, because we could see here that there are divergent perspectives from the EU side, from the Russian side, on the actual steps that need to be taken for the implementation of the Minsk agreements. And this is part of the explanation of the current deadlock situation which we have in EU-Russia relations. This is a first important introduction to the broader understanding of the problem. And it actually links quite well with another contribution in the book by Irina Petrova, who focuses on the divergent perspectives which the EU and Russia have. It's quite fascinating to see the divergent approaches of the EU and Russian official authorities on the sanctions, but also on the Minsk agreements and on the steps that need to be taken for the implementation of these agreements. And we could basically say that this is, to a large extent, a kind of a blame game, in the sense that Russia is pointing at Ukraine for not taking sufficient steps in the process of implementation of the Minsk agreements, whereas the EU and Ukraine also refer essentially to Russia and the requirements, the necessary steps that need to be taken from the Russian side. So we have here a clear problem in terms of sequencing, in terms of timing, and this is to a large extent explained in this part of the book, the background, the different perspectives, but also the role of the EU member states in this Minsk process. We have a contribution by Tony van der Tocht, who looks into the role of the EU member states, and particularly Germany, the Netherlands, but also France, in this process, where we had several attempts to reinvigorate the process, even though they were not very successful. But here, I think part of the explanation of the misunderstandings on both sides are actually tackled. Now, as part of this chapter, we also have a number of contributions that focus specifically on the sanctions and also on the political, but also the legal dimension of the sanctions, because the sanctions have been challenged on several occasions before the Court of Justice of the European Union. And this is explained in contributions by Alexandra Hofer, by Kirill Antin, and by Celia Chalet. And it's interesting here as well that we have both the EU and Russian perspectives, because we have both EU and Russian authors tackling this particular issue of the role of the Court of Justice. Now, this was the first part and the first key principle in EU-Russia relations. Then we have the second chapter, where we focus on the second principle. And the second principle is a rather peculiar principle, because that principle is not directly about Russia itself, but it is about the countries in between the EU and Russia, the so-called shared neighborhood, where it is important for the European Union that there are strengthened relations with its Eastern partners. And this, of course, should be understood in the broader context of the challenges of EU-Russia relations, in particular the establishment of the Eurasian Economic Union, which is very much promoted by Russian President Putin for a couple of years now, and which I tend to see as Russia's neighborhood strategy. The idea that all the countries of the former Soviet Union will engage in a process of regional integration, and that as one bloc called Eurasian Economic Union will then engage in a dialogue with the European Union, leading to a kind of integration of the integrations, this bloc-to-bloc approach. Now, for the EU side, of course, it is important that there is sufficient leeway to have a bilateral approach and further development of bilateral relations with the individual countries in the EU's eastern neighborhood. That's the core characteristic of the Eastern Partnership and European neighborhood policy as such. So this is, let's say, the explanation why we have this important second principle among this list of 5 guiding principles. And here we focused, or at least one of the contributions in the book by Laura Delcourt and Narine Gazarian focuses explicitly on the role of Armenia. Armenia is a very interesting case study because Armenia is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, even though it initially started negotiations on an association agreement with the EU. Later, for a number of internal domestic political reasons, it was decided that these negotiations on an association agreement could not continue, and Armenia joined the Eurasian Economic Union. Now, the key challenge here was to upgrade the old partnership and cooperation agreement, taking into account this new circumstance. Now, this was a rather complex exercise and a difficult balancing act, one could say, but it nevertheless resulted in a new important bilateral agreement, and not an association agreement, not exactly the same as the type of agreements we have with Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, but an alternative type of bilateral agreement called a comprehensive and enhanced partnership agreement. And this new agreement is analyzed in this particular contribution in the book and could be regarded as an example of the strengthened bilateral relations with an Eastern Partnership country that is in this very peculiar situation of being also a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. Now, other contributions in this particular part of the book focus on more specific issues. We have a contribution on the problem of the so-called de facto states. And we have de facto states in Moldova and Georgia, but also, well, the problem in Donbass also to a large extent relates to this broader problem of how the EU can define its relations with these non-recognized entities. So we have a contribution by Benedikt Hartzl here from Austria, who is an expert in this particular topic. And last contribution with respect to the second principle on the shared neighborhood is written by Ihor Merhem-Eire on the practice of visa diplomacy. And that's a very interesting development where we can see that both Russia and the EU try to use visa and the process of visa facilitation, visa liberalization as an instrument in their policies towards the shared neighborhood between the EU and Russia. So we try to combine both the broader picture and focus on some specific questions with respect to the second principle. So now I'll pass the floor to Fabienne to continue with the other principles.
Yes, okay, thanks, Peter. Well, then if we move on to the third part of the book, so the third part addresses the issue of resilience, which is the third principle guiding the EU's policy towards Russia. Now, importantly, this principle is framed in terms of resilience to Russian threats, which is slightly different from how resilience is normally being framed in the EU's global strategy. So in this regard, then in the first chapter, in this third part, Elena Pavlova and Tatiana Romanova, they offer a critical assessment exactly of the EU's understanding of the concept of resilience in the context of EU-Russia relations. Now, what they argue is that the EU seems to use a concept of resilience to frame its policy and norms very explicitly in opposition to the norms and policies of Russia. And so this basically turns Russia from a potential partner of the EU into a threat for the EU, and basically an actor whose behavior is divergent from that of the EU. They argue that the problem is that, well, Moscow is not really ready to move into any new type of behavior, and so to adapt its behavior. So this basically leads to a dead end in terms of any chance of improvement in the relationship. So this is what Elena Pavlova and Tatiana Romanova have argued. Then the second chapter in this further on resilience focuses on the EU's energy relationship with Russia. And so in this chapter, Marco Sidi focuses on energy security, which is also included under this third principle. But interestingly, he also writes that this energy relationship basically also falls under the fourth principle, selective engagement. Why is this? Well, although, yeah, it's clear that the EU has a problem with a strong dependence on energy for Russia, it also still is in the EU's interest to maintain this trade with Russia for the time being. So as Russia is the main external supplier of fossil fuels to the EU, and it's in the EU's economic interest to maintain this energy trade with Moscow, energy can also be considered an area where engagement with Russia is necessary. So Marco Sidi, in this chapter, he points to a certain duality in the EU's policy towards Russia in the sphere of energy. And so this responds then, on the one hand, to a political logic when we're talking about trying to reduce this energy dependency, but also to commercial logic in the sense that it's still in the EU's economic interest to have this trade with Russia. But then specifically when it comes to addressing the EU's political concern related to this excessive dependence on Russian energy supplies, and so this is particularly concerning gas supplies. Well, there Marco Sidi finds that the EU has actually made progress in addressing these concerns. So the EU has been developing legislation such as the third energy package, and it has also developed a policy framework, namely the Energy Union. At the same time, the EU has also been strengthening interconnections between the national energy markets in the EU, and it has also supported the construction of new infrastructure in some member states, which were dependent really on a single supplier, namely Russia. Then moving on to the final chapter in this part on resilience. This is actually your chapter, Andreas. So this chapter focuses on the question of cybersecurity. And so your chapter outlines how the EU has been trying to boost its resilience to Russian cyber threats. So your chapter finds that the EU has managed to update its legal framework in the field of cybersecurity, and it also tried to harmonize the legislation in all EU member states. Also, it has been trying to enhance cooperation and build trust among the national cybersecurity units of the member states. Then when we come to the fourth part of the book, so this touches on the principle of selective engagement, which I already just mentioned when talking about energy. So then when it comes to selective engagement with Russia, the respective chapters in the book focus on a number of specific policy areas where either selective engagement is already taking place or where it could potentially take place. Then in the first chapter, Olga Potemkina looks at selective engagement in the area of transnational security threats. Here it seems that cooperation is taking place, but it is really limited to just consultations and exchange of information. Then moving on to the field of renewable energy as a potential area where selective engagement could take place. Niels Smeets argues that there is effectively substantial scope for selective engagement, and this is really an area that stands out because there is a very strong mutual interest in cooperation. Then finally, when it comes to cooperation in relation to the Arctic, here we have Thomas Kruisman, who also identifies a lot of potential for cooperation, but he is then rather skeptical about the likelihood that this will happen in the short term. Then moving on to the fifth, but also the last part of the book, which focuses on the fifth principle, which spells out the need to support Russian civil society and also the need to engage in people-to-people contacts. Well, this final part includes, first of all, a contribution by Yelena Belokurova and Andrei Demidov, who focus on the EU support of Russia's civil society. This is then followed by a chapter by Domenico Valenza on the development of the EU's cultural relations with Russia. And then finally, there is a chapter by Natalia Leskina, which focuses on EU-Russia cooperation in the sphere of higher education. Now, to sum up the contributions in this final part, interestingly, it turns out that this fifth principle is probably the most successful of all 5 principles. So the EU has clearly invested significantly in strengthening societal ties through, for instance, student exchanges, but also through civil society cooperation, and also through research cooperation, also, for instance, in the field of cross-border cooperation. Now, the chapter by Belokurova and Demidov, for instance, shows that the EU has been following a sort of 2-track approach towards support for civil society in the past few years. So the EU is continuing support for civil society under the already existing instruments. However, because of the shrinking space for civil society activities in Russia, the EU also had to introduce new, let's say, more indirect channels of civil society support. This then links up to the chapter by Domenico Valenza, because actually what the EU has done is it has embedded part of its civil society support within its wider cultural and public diplomacy towards Russia. And so the chapter by Domenico Valenza really shows that this approach is actually paying off, in the sense that the EU's engagement in the cultural sphere is playing an important role in breaking civil society isolation and also in nurturing long-term openness in Russia. And then finally, as the chapter by Natalia Leskina has pointed out, also in the field of research cooperation and cooperation in the sphere of higher education, EU-Russia relations have been quite fruitful. So the past few years have seen an increased interest from Russian academics and from Russian universities in collaborating with European partners, and so also in participation in EU-funded programs. So I think it's fair to conclude that this field of people-to-people contacts has been a sort of privileged area, or has become a privileged area of intervention to maintain a dialogue with Russia at a societal level.
Thank you so much, both of you, for briefly as possible, actually breaking down like the whole book for us, for the audience of this today's podcast discussion. Now, I'm also pleased to hear that towards the end of the book, there is also a positive note of EU's engagement with society and the cultural aspect. I would like to move slightly away from the book and based on your own understanding from your work, the academic level, the civil society level, and with your experience through this book. Now, with 5 out of 6 Eastern Partnership countries in our shared neighborhood, stuck with frozen or ongoing conflicts, some for decades, does it make sense to keep talking with Russia about peaceful resolutions? Can we really expect that Ukraine will be any different than Georgia, for example? Will any of these conflicts ever be resolved when we don't want to understand each other? Peter, I would like to start with you, if that's okay, and then I would also like to hear your thoughts on that question, Fabienne, as well.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting question, a very relevant question indeed. I mean, it's of course always difficult to predict the future, but I think there is no alternative than working into, or at least trying to find a peaceful solution to the conflicts, or at least to work in the direction of containment. That is. Certainly in the current circumstances where we had such high tensions until very recently at the border between Russia and Ukraine, I think containing Russia and avoiding that certain red lines will be crossed, that is already very important, and that already requires a continuous effort from the EU side, but also from the EU member states. And I think that here it will be important, and that's in my view a very important test case for the EU's common foreign and security policy, that the member states require to support a unanimous position within the EU and within the EU institutions, and preferably also through the EU institutions, because it seems that from a Russian perspective, the interest in engaging with the EU as an international actor has decreased. At least that is my understanding of the recent visits of High Representative Brill to Moscow, and where we had this infamous press conference afterwards, where the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov more or less explicitly provided the message that, well, the EU is not such a relevant actor for Russia. Russia is much more interested in developing bilateral relations with key EU member states. And I think that for Russia, developing close relations with Germany, for instance, is much more important than engaging explicitly with the EU. So that is a key challenge, and that is a true challenge for the EU to proceed, also taking into account the internal divisions within the European Union, where we do have a number of skeptical member states, but that remains very crucial. I think the further development of the EU's common foreign and security policy, the instruments in this area, and also the distinction perhaps between the EU and NATO, because that is something which always strikes me when I visit Russia, and sometimes when I teach to Russian students, that I always receive questions about NATO and the link between the EU and NATO. So from a Russian perspective, NATO and the EU are frequently linked, and I think that the EU here might stress even more its autonomous position, its role that it can play in this process of solving the disputes in the eastern neighborhood. But of course, this will be a long-term process. I mean, I don't think we can expect any evolutions in the current circumstances. But engaging, and that is one of the lessons perhaps of the conclusions of our book as well, is that apart from focusing on the dialogue with the official authorities, engaging with the civil society level, that is a crucial element, probably will remain a crucial element of the EU's efforts in this area.
Peter, if before I give the floor to Fabienne, just a follow-up or a very brief comment, if I may. You mentioned about usually like students that from Russia, when you're delivering lectures, they always ask you about like EU and NATO and so on. Is it maybe something that we missed when it comes to communicating things with Russia, that EU and NATO are not necessarily the same thing, or that when the EU is, was expanding towards Russia, the NATO not necessarily had to follow, or did we miss something actually in terms of communicating? Because I think sometimes, and this is like my personal observation, I might be wrong, but that's why we're discussing this here now. I just think that sometimes we miscommunicated things with Russia, and there are different perceptions of like when the EU is like expanding to a XYZ like state towards Russia's, let's say, near abroad, then that means that NATO will also follow at some point. So what did we miss here?
Yeah, I think it is indeed important to explain the long-term objectives perhaps more clearly, and to engage also with Russia and with other countries that are not involved in the process of enlargement. That was particularly the case with respect to the EU's eastward enlargement, I think, where it was perhaps too easily assumed from the EU point of view that, well, this is a process that is beneficial for all countries, also the ones that are not involved in the process. And of course, all time and energy within the European Union was focused on making this process of enlargement a success. And only afterwards, we started thinking about European neighborhood policy, about an Eastern partnership, but perhaps this could have been done earlier. This was perhaps a process that could have been developed in parallel, in the process of enlargement and European neighborhood policy and Eastern Partnership. So that perhaps is one of the lessons that could be learned. And of course, I mean, this distinction between the EU and NATO is something which strikes me all the time, because I'm also teaching about European neighborhood policy and EU's bilateral relations with the countries in the shared neighborhoods. And I never receive a question on NATO when I teach on these topics in Ghent or the College of Europe, where I'm also teaching. But when I teach about these topics in Russia, I always receive questions about the let's say the broader picture and what these agreements mean for the process of NATO enlargement. So I think, I mean, perhaps here as well, there could be distinction between the official authorities and the population at large, but explaining what the EU is and what it's not might also be an important element to take into account for the future.
Thank you very much, Peter. Fabienne, I would like also to hear your side of the story when it comes to my question, and also if you want to comment on the follow-up question that I addressed to Peter as well. Please go ahead.
Okay, well, I think maybe want to take this opportunity to emphasize what is definitely one of the main findings of the book, so that indeed there is this profound discord between the EU and Russia, which is reflected in their diverging perceptions of each other. And this has, of course, then further engendered this deep ingrained misunderstanding and this very deep lack of trust. And as we have seen, also based on other studies, so diverging images and diverging perceptions, they can be major obstacles to the enhancement of relations. And this definitely also applies to the relations between the EU and Russia. And so from our point of view, it's really essential to understand how these divergences have emerged in the first place, and then how they have been manifested. So I think this is very important if we want to be able to identify any confidence building measures in order to restore this trust, but also if ultimately, we can develop a common vision for cooperation. But then I would say that the key challenge really in defining a new long-term strategy for the future of EU-Russia relations will be really to develop a common vision for cooperation, which is based on mutually acceptable parameters. But yeah, for the EU, indeed, this is even more challenging because the EU has to develop a vision which is not just shared by Russia, but which is also internally shared by the member states. And as we all know, they are quite divided when it comes to the topic of Russia and how to engage with Russia. But I would say that, to restore trust, and Peter will also agree on this, because we've argued this in the concluding chapter. It seems essential to sort of develop a step-by-step approach based on confidence-building measures, which, if It's a big if. So if this would be successfully implemented, this could eventually lead towards broader and long-term cooperation. But in any case, in the current climates, I don't think anyone sees any potential for improvement in the short term. So even today, I mean, even just trying to think about these confidence building measures is already very difficult. So it's really, we really need to move beyond the current complete lack of trust in order to think about possible confidence building measures.
Fabienne, since you mentioned right now the step-by-step approach, and you talked about engagement with Russia at some areas. I mean, one part of the edited volume is dedicated to selective engagement with Russia. Now, given the current state of affairs, as we all know, between EU and Russia, and the growing tension in the Donbass region, I would like to ask you, first of all, if you believe that there are areas where trust among both parties can be developed, to name a few areas that either academics or civil society or policymakers can work together.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, okay, well, maybe I should also point out that actually the principle of selective engagement, of all the 5 principles, mostly reflects the spirit of principled pragmatism, which is very prominent in the EU's global strategy. But as we have seen, based on contributions in the book, the implementation of this principle, and despite it being so much reflective of this principled pragmatism, well, the implementation of a principle turns out to be very difficult. And this is, of course, in large part because of the sanctions regime and because of the lack of trust. And so this really complicates the level of engagement in practice. And it's clear that the developments of the past few months, they have just further revealed us how deep the lack of trust is between the EU and Russia. So in that regard, I guess, yeah, the picture is again very bleak. But on top of this problem with lack of trust, what the book has also shown is that part of the problem for implementing selective engagement is that there's not really a precise definition of what is selective engagement and under which conditions there could be selective engagement beyond the fact that, yeah, it should be an area of policy of cooperation which is in the interest of both parties. And because of this absence of a precise definition, it's also very difficult for the EU and the member states to agree exactly on which areas qualify for selective engagement with Russia. And again, yeah, as I mentioned, yes, of course, the member states are internally divided when it comes to Russia. And then here, for instance, we have one group of member states, including Germany and France, but also some institutional actors within the EU, and in particular the head of the EU delegation to Russia, Markus Ederer. So they have all been proposing specific areas for selective engagement, which includes the Arctic, but also digital cooperation on digital issues, cooperation with the Eurasian Economic Union, cooperation on regional infrastructure, and also the Northern Dimension. Now, unfortunately, other EU member states, including Poland and Lithuania, yeah, they have been really fiercely opposed to extending the areas of selective engagement because basically they lost faith in a cooperative approach towards Russia. Now, we of course also have to understand why they have this position, and so these are mostly EU member states which, based on their own historical experiences with Russia, believe that the Ukraine crisis has just confirmed the failure of a cooperative approach towards the current regime in Russia. So this is also an important element. So they have issues mostly with the regime in the Kremlin, not necessarily with Russia as a country. Now, nevertheless, there have been cases of selective engagement already. And also actually in his speech to the European Parliament this week, High Representative Josep Borrell also pointed to these cases. So he mentioned, for instance, the example of Iran, which is really a rare example of fruitful cooperation between the EU and Russia, as they really managed to join forces in trying to save the joint comprehensive plan of action for Iran. And this was particularly actually in the face of the withdrawal of the United States from this agreement. But Brill also, for instance, now pointed to climate change as another potential field where Russia and the EU could cooperate. This was also highlighted in the chapter by Elsuwege, where when he talked about cooperation on renewable energy as really having a lot of potential. So I think all in all, despite the fact that really at the highest level, we have this lack of trust, I think in certain areas, especially if it's of, let's say, very clear, where there's a really clear common interest, there, like in the case of Iran, there, yes, they can definitely cooperate. And even also in, let's say, less politicized fields such as climate change or renewable energy, there is still the scope for cooperation. But it will remain difficult for sure.
All right. Thank you very much, Fabienne. I think that we almost run out of time with this discussion. At this point, I would like to thank both of you, Peter and Fabienne, for your excellent work on producing this excellent edited volume, and also to all the contributors who provided their chapters, including myself. So once again, I would like personally to thank you for this opportunity, not only for me to contribute to your book, but also for participating in today's podcast discussion. I hope that the edited volume will receive the attention that deserves, and wish you all the best in your work in your respective fields. It was great to have you both here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much. You're most welcome, and hope we can continue our cooperation in the future.
Excellent. So that was the ENC In Depth podcast, and I'm Andreas Marazis. Thank you very much.